James Baldwin, along with his mentor Richard Wright, the author of Native Son, and Ralph Ellison, the author of Invisible Man, was the most distinguished and important African-American fiction writer of the 20th century. At the time his work came into public recognition. In addition to being a short story writer, Baldwin was a novelist and an essayist who was born in Harlem to a clergyman father. Baldwin's grandfather was a slave. As a boy, Baldwin preached in the Pentecostal church, but gave up preaching while he was still in high school and went off to live in Greenwich Village, where he met Richard Wright. Richard Wright wrote the classic novel of African-American alienation and identity about a character, a murderer, named Bigger Thomas, Native Son, published in 1940. Ralph Ellison's famous novel of black existentialism and identity, Invisible Man, was published in 1952, the year before Baldwin's groundbreaking autobiographical novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. Sonnys Blues, the story we're going to be talking about, appeared in 1957. And like his mentor Richard Wright, Baldwin published short fiction as well as novels, and Wright's Uncle Tom's Children was at this point a work that probably had a good deal of influence on Baldwin. It was a collection of short stories that included an essay called The Ethics of Living Jim Crow, published in 1938. This was Wright's essay before the stories in Uncle Tom's Children, and it was an essay essentially that had autobiographical elements in it about a boy who was told when white kids threw cinders at him and he fought back, not to fight back, who talked about the whole ethic of living Jim Crow, living in Natchez, Mississippi, under the apartheid that existed then, as having to follow certain rules, not to look at white women, not to even look like you're looking at a white woman, not to mention, for example, that you're at any way interested in a figure like H.L. Mencken, who was sympathetic to civil rights. In fact, the young boy in that particular essay by Richard Wright goes to the library in Natchez, Mississippi, and presents a note to the librarian that says, give this nigger boy a copy of Mencken's essays. And of course, the librarian handed him Mencken's essays. He couldn't say, I want this for myself. It really gives us a sense of just how disparate and bigoted the racial South was at that time. And Baldwin, although he was not as political a writer as Wright, learned a great deal from Wright about those inequities and plumbing his own experience to bring them out in his fiction. Ralph Ellison, on the other hand, was a novelist who was not as political as Wright, and to a great extent Baldwin identified with in different ways, as we'll find out. But he also wrote stories that really can be seen as stories, like The Battle Royal, often anthologized as a standalone short story, but it really presents the first and opening sequence to Invisible Man, where a number of young black boys are taken and put in the ring to fight each other, to the great entertainment of all of the white power brokers in the town, who essentially want to see them beat up and want to see them beat up each other. Baldwin had a great deal of anger against racial inequities that we saw in Wright, and that came to the fore in Invisible Man as well, and he wrote a collection of essays called Notes of a Native Son, obviously giving a kind of nod to Richard Wright. Though I should mention that he and Wright had a parting of the ways when Baldwin criticized Wright for not making his characters psychologically complex enough. And this is where we realize Baldwin and Wright do part ways, because Baldwin later stated that he loved Richard Wright, but he was only expressing his own sense of how a writer should work with character. Baldwin was a great storyteller, but he wasn't as didactic or as political as Wright, who was a former member of the Communist Party. And in that sense, he and Ralph Ellison were really more in literary kinship. Both were concerned a great deal more with literature as art than literature serving propaganda purposes or social and political consciousness. Baldwin was a novelist in the tradition of Henry James, deeply concerned with the demands of a higher and noble artistic calling, but nevertheless rooted to a deep concern with his own black identity and with racial justice, and really with what the major black cultural and political figure W.E.B. Du Bois called, in his most famous book title, The Souls of Black Folks. Baldwin, as a storyteller, was rooted in Harlem and Greenwich Village and nourished in the great tradition of the spirituals, gospel, the blues, and jazz. The Harlem Renaissance flourished in the 1920s and saw one of the greatest outputs of black identity and artistry that would carry on in Baldwin's own boyhood and youth. He wrote within what poet and essayist William Carlos Williams called the American grain, but his roots were in the black experience, and the short fiction associated with writers of the Harlem Renaissance like Gene Toomer, who was strongly influenced in turn by Sherwood Anderson, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston certainly played their way into contributing to Baldwin's vision as a writer. There was as well the influence of other American storytellers like John Dos Passos and John Steinbeck and Ernest Hemingway, apparent in Baldwin's storytelling. But he derived much, like his black American predecessors, from the black oral tradition. And there was a lack of recognizing the artistry and the talent of black writers, just like there was for so many years with women writers in short fiction. That's why Baldwin becomes a central figure. He also became an expatriate. He left the United States and lived most of his adult life in France. His greatest theme throughout his writing career was freedom. And as a black homosexual man, he certainly understood forces that oppressed freedom. Sonnys Blues is a story about freedom, and it centers on two brothers from Harlem. One, a would-be middle-class teacher, the other, his younger brother, a jazz musician who was also a drug addict. When the story opens, the narrator, Sonny's older brother, who, like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, never has a name, tells of the fright and alarm at his hearing of Sonnys having been arrested for heroin use. On one level, this is simply a story of an older brother coming to a greater understanding of his younger brother, the younger brother whose first words he heard and whom he caught from falling when Sonny, his younger brother, took his first steps. The younger brother whom, as the story develops, he sees shaving for the first time and looks at and says, "Are you smoking?" The narrator, from the story's opening, is concerned about Sonny, is disturbed and frightened by the story about his brother's arrest for heroin that he reads about in the newspaper. He had been picked up, we're told, the evening before in a raid on an apartment downtown for peddling and using heroin. And this makes his brother real to him. There had been some distance between them. There had been a separation, misunderstandings. But this makes his brother real again to him, and it makes his need for his brother palpable, makes his love for his brother palpable. The narrator wants to understand his brother, wants to know about his inside life. And the story moves us ultimately through a trajectory where ultimately the narrator does learn about Sonny through Sonny's music. And he makes his brother real in terms of really being real and not abstract, in terms of understanding on a deeper and more profound level who his brother is. The brothers represent a couple of polarities. There's a tension. The narrator decides, in fact, to live a family life, middle class, teach algebra, follow the equations, as it were, of middle class life, as opposed to Sonny's decision that he wants, as he describes it to his brother, to play jazz. The mother of these boys, before her death, entreats the older brother to watch out for his younger brother and to keep him from falling. And this desire of the older brother to keep his younger brother safe and guide him to equations of respectability and sobriety represents one of the basic conflicts in the story between the brothers. But that idea of safe and what safe means also plays a preeminent role in the story, because there's always a sense of menace, and it is tied in many respects to racial identity. Let's go back to the chasm, though, that exists between these two brothers. It's really best seen in Sonny's creation of another family which he chooses. In one of the story's flashbacks, chosen really over his narrator brother. Sonny's world, Sonny's kingdom, is his music, and those who are members of his family are those who play music with him. And by story's end, the narrator has to enter into that kingdom in order to understand it. He has to really hear the music in order to understand who and what his brother is, but also, paradoxically, who he is. Because what the music speaks to deeply is his own identity. And it's revelatory to mention here that when the narrator mentions Louis Armstrong to Sonny, his brother, as a jazz figure, Sonny corrects him and says, that's old-time stuff. He mentions the current figure, current to him at the time, of Bird, Charlie Parker. By this time, Sonny is starting to shave and smoke. And he tells his brother that playing is the only thing he wants to do. And his brother says people can't always do exactly what they want to do, whereupon Sonny responds, I think people ought to do what they want to do. So we see this brotherly divide between philosophically acting on how one ought to live one's life or being, like the narrator, less willing to give oneself over to passion. This is also a story about music, and about music as a means of communicating, music as a vehicle through which As I said, the older brother comes to understand his younger brother, but we find that the blues particularly link the brothers, because behind the blues, behind jazz, are the spirituals, and behind the spirituals are the songs of slaves. In other words, the music can take a black man back to his roots, and that's exactly what the music does when he begins, the narrator, to hear the music on the level that he needs to understand it viscerally, internally, in his own life. And by the way, one of the really impressive things about this story is it's a story about Harlem, but Baldwin is able to show us how black people in Harlem throughout the story express themselves in different ways via music, showing how music not only informs Sonnys life, but plays an integral role in the life of black folks in Harlem. Early on in the story, a boy is whistling a complicated tune. It's almost a simple sounding tune, but in many ways it's also complicated, and he sounds as though he's a bird. This is early on when the narrator finds out about Sonny being arrested. And by the way, soon after finding it out, he meets a crony of Sonny's who's really just out to get some money from him so that he can go and score some dope. And he feels a sense of revulsion, and he feels a sense of responsibility for Sonny, and the man who's panhandling him also feels a sense of responsibility for Sonny because he knows what happened. But as we get into the story deeper, we realize that whether people are addicted to drugs or not in Harlem, music is an important and vital part of their expression. A woman who's described, for example, as being a semi-whore, probably an addict with a battered face, is nonetheless keeping time to music. And the narrator's memory of his parents is one of them seated with church folks and relatives on Sundays, in which he highlights in his memory the jangling beat of a tambourine from one of the churches close by. The mother tells the narrator a story, and it's of the father's brother. Again, a story about brothers. It includes the fact that the father's brother had a guitar and sang and was out whistling on a night he was run down by a number of drunken white men. The narrator whistles, in fact, after Sonny and he fight, and a woman sings before the two of them head off toward the end of the story to Greenwich Village, where Sonny plays. Street music is heard from a revival meeting. It's the music of spiritual sustenance. We're told that it, quote, seemed to soothe the poison out of them, that is, those who were performing the music. And when the narrator really hears his brother's blues, Sonny's blues, and listens to what they communicate, he understands his brother in a deeper and more meaningful way, but also understands himself and the link he has to suffering, darkness, trouble, and menace, all mentioned throughout the story. His own personal suffering as well, because we find out that he has lost a daughter, appropriately named Grace. Ultimately, music links them and us to the human condition, to what may be, in the words of the narrator, the only light we've got in all this darkness. The language of music and Baldwin's style of improvisational sounding prose highlights and reflects that, creates its own dialogue and discourse, but also establishes and evokes great emotions. After the music, the narrator alludes to something called the cup of trembling from Isaiah. Baldwin knew his scripture quite well. And that passage from 51:17 Isaiah goes, "Awake, awake, stand up, O Jerusalem, which hast drunk at the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury. Thou hast drunken the dregs of the cup of trembling and wrung them out. Behold, I have taken out of thine hand the cup of trembling, even the dregs of the eye of my fury. Thou shalt no more drink it again, but I shall put it into the hands of them that afflict thee." These are pretty strong words, and these are, to put it mildly, strong, evocative words which talk about an enemy and which talk about taking out affliction and speaking about a resonant past that has to do with oppression and suffering, but that will bring forth perhaps the possibility of something of renewal through a change that may indeed be apocalyptic. Baldwin, remember, was giving Pentecostal sermons as a boy in Harlem when he was 14. And this ending is prophetic, it's sermon-like, and it highlights the message for black people for the future that the narrator derives from the power of the music, which is really the power of his people's history. Isaiah holds the messianic prophecy, And there is a direct link between the message in that prophecy and the music, as if the music is directly tied to the Word of God. Now, we've seen so many stories in the post-World War II era which had a rising secularism in them, loss of faith, challenging the church and its institutions. And Baldwin was no different in that sense. In fact, we find in this story the difference in generations. Sonny writes a letter to his older brother and says, "I wish I could put my will in God like our parents did." Or when the mother tells the narrator of the story, the older brother of her husband, his father, and his death at the hands of white men, she says, "But I have my Redeemer." In other words, that generation had faith that the younger generation seems to not any longer have. But nevertheless, there's that sense at the end that Baldwin couldn't escape in terms of bringing in Isaiah and bringing in prophecy and bringing in this messianic note of the possibility of rather soul-racking and world-racking change. I want to mention here that there were a couple of African-American psychiatrists, Greer and Cobbs, who posited, not long after Baldwin's story appeared, that blacks in America feel rage. They linked it to what W.E.B. Du Bois, in a later essay, and Baldwin called dual consciousness. The notion that if you're an African American, you see yourself in terms of who you are, but you're often inevitably seen in terms of what you are. That's the whole theme of Invisible Man, that people didn't see him for who he was, they only saw him for what he was, and thereby rendered him invisible. Only saw, in other words, his melanin, his skin color. The children in the story's opening scene are viewed as growing up with a rush and having their heads bump abruptly against the low ceilings of their actual possibilities. And we see this black rage through the narrator's view of his neighborhood and of Harlem and what he calls the vivid killing streets of his and Sonny's boyhood. This is not, he tells us, a boyhood where playgrounds have jacks and jump rope and skating. In fact, he describes his playground as essentially the streets. He says, most of the stores from which we had stolen, the basements in which we had first tried sex, the rooftops from which we had hurled tin cans and bricks. But he's talking about houses in Harlem, houses years later from his boyhood that are exactly like the houses of our past, yet dominated the landscape. Boys exactly like the boys we had once been found themselves smothering in these houses, came down into the street for light and air and found themselves encircled by disaster. Some escaped the trap, most didn't. It's a picture, really, that you could characterize as being certainly highly politicized, but it's a picture, nevertheless, it's quite accurate for the time about Harlem and about what engendered rage in so many of these young males in Harlem, feeling that they couldn't escape these low ceilings, that they couldn't escape the streets where they grew up essentially learning things very different than the kids in the white suburbs, and a way of life very different. And here's Baldwin bringing this into focus in a way that's really quite vivid and quite immediate. And the characterizing of their youth with images of thieving and too early sex and rooftops from which tin cans and bricks were hurled is of a poor and debilitating environment. It's a trap where even those who escape leave something behind, like Baldwin tells us, an amputated animal leaving its leg in a trap. It's not a childhood, by contrast, of roller skating or skipping rope. Menace is tied to the reality of black folks in the story, and the story the mother tells of her husband's brother only makes that menace all the more real. Safe is a word which leads to irony in light of the story the mother tells. We also read of the hidden menace at 110th Street and Lenox Avenue. And race is highlighted throughout the story in the use of the word dicty to describe Isabel's parents. It was a pejorative word used for light-skinned blacks who were much more middle class, what the black sociologist Franklin Frazier would have called black bourgeoisie. These are the parents of the narrator's wife, who we find out in one of the flashback scenes are separated from Sonny by class and also fail to understand what it means to live with sound as Sonny plays for his life when he's staying with them. But even these dicty Negroes, as they would have been called at the time, feel the fear of the racial divide that can bring out rage. Isabel's mother is frightened that Sonny should even be in a white girl's apartment. Think about the old stories of Langston Hughes about black slaves who were afraid of nothing and fought each other and beat each other up with trees that they pulled out by the trunks. But then when they heard that a white woman was present, they scattered and they fled out of fear that they should be seen half naked fighting, or in any other sense in a way that could be compromising with a white woman. That's the ethic of living Jim Crow again that Richard Wright wrote about. This story opens with the narrator feeling the unreality and ice in his own veins as he reads of Sonnys bust for heroin. Sonnys friend is also an addict, looking for money from the narrator for his next fix, but much of the story's imagery shifts back and forth. In fact, one of the testaments, again, to Baldwin as a craftsman is how we see him moving between past and present, telling stories, picking up stories, moving within the present and the frame of the present, but then telling stories not only, for example, like the one on that dark road with the brothers, but also about Sonny's boyhood and the narrator's relationship to him. As we move not only from past to present and present to past, but we move from light to dark, from inside to outside. And tied in centrally with the problem of drug addiction, which is Sonny's problem, but which is also a problem of Harlem, of course. Sonny says at one point, it's terrible sometimes inside. He sees himself in a kind of funk that he says can happen again. In the scene before the brothers go to Greenwich Village to hear Sonny play, Sonny talks about needing drugs to be able to stand it, whatever it is. I'm reminded of the story that W.J. Cash, who wrote probably what some say was the greatest suicide note of all time, when he said, I can't stand it anymore and I don't even know what it is. Well, Sonny can't stand it either, but it has to do with human suffering, with the experience of having grown up in Harlem, trying to escape Harlem, as he does, unsuccessfully. He talks about his funk, he talks about his stink, he talks about something he never thought he could be on drugs, and confesses to leaving Harlem to get away from drugs. Confesses that to his brother, and the fact that it can come again. Also, when he hears a woman singing, Sonny talks about how repulsive it must be to suffer as much as she appears to be suffering. And we realize by inference that this is a story about suffering, and it's seen as a cause of drug addiction. Though the theme of suffering is also tied to the loss of the narrator's daughter, Grace. The narrator doesn't fall into drug addiction, but he certainly comes to a clearer understanding of Sonny's suffering and others who are similarly in suffering, whether they're addicted or not. The story has strong generational significance in that Sonny, as he points out in a letter to the narrator, wishes he could have that faith that his mother had. We see that faith after she tells the story of the father's brother's death and says, I praise my Redeemer. Without faith, there seems to be left for many only music with Godspeed and Amen attached to it in the final scene in which Sonny plays, or drugs. This is, I think, one of the most powerful stories of the 20th century, not only because it covers so much expansively, but works on so many levels and provides keen insight into the inner life of a jazz musician and a deeper understanding of the scourge of drugs and what causes drug use in many instances, as well as of the stunted and painful life of growing up in or living in Harlem. The language of the story is soaring and lyrical. It's really responsible to a great degree for its power. Toward the end, it takes on a definite musicality, an evocative power of its own, in which we, as readers, experience not only the narration of Baldwin's prose, but we experience what the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called the pure form of music. Nietzsche believed that music was the only thing that had pure form, as opposed to any of the other arts. But Baldwin really approximates that sense of musicality. I mean, we've certainly been introduced to other writers who have music in their prose. Paley is a good example. Cadence and rhythm of her sentences, which you hear orally, A-U-R-A-L-L-Y, as well as orally in the sense of the oral tradition. But it's a sense of the improvisational nature of the blues as well, and the spiritual feeling that comes through in that music. It's a stylistic shift that Baldwin employs in the nightclub scene, and it's nothing short of astonishing. And I thought I'd try in my modest and admittedly limited way to at least give you a sense of how I believe this sounds and how it reads. This is after the line, it's the only light we've got in all this darkness. And this tale, according to that face, that body, those strong hands on those strings, has another aspect in every country, and a new depth in every generation. Listen, Creole seemed to be saying. Creole is Sonnys fellow musician. Listen. Fellow musician who backs him up. Now these are Sonnys blues. He made the little black man on the drums know it, and the bright brown man on the horn. Creole wasn't trying any longer to get Sonny in the water. He was wishing him Godspeed. Then he stepped back, very slowly, filling the air with the immense suggestion that Sonny speak for himself. Then they all gathered around Sonny, and Sonny played. Every now and again, one of them seemed to say Amen. Sonny's fingers filled the air with life, his life. But that life contained so many others. And Sonny went all the way back. He really began with the spare, flat statement of the opening phrase of the song. Then he began to make it his. It was very beautiful because it wasn't hurried, and it was no longer a lament. I seemed to hear with what burning he had made it his, with what burning we had yet to make it ours. How we could cease lamenting. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did. Yet there was no battle in his face now. I heard what he had gone through, and would continue to go through until he came to rest in earth. He had made it his, that long line of which we knew only Mama and Daddy, and he was giving it back, as everything must be given back, so that passing through death, it can live forever. I saw my mother's face again, and felt for the first time how the stones of the road she had walked on must have bruised her feet. I saw the moonlit road where my father's brother died, and it brought something else back to me, and carried me past it. I saw my little girl again, and felt Isabel's tears again, and I felt my own tears begin to rise, and I was yet aware that this was only a moment, that the world waited outside as hungry as a tiger, and that trouble stretched above us longer than the sky. Then it was over. Creole and Sonny let out their breath, both soaking wet and grinning. There was a lot of applause, and some of it was real. In the dark, the girl came by, and I asked her to take drinks to the bandstand. There was a long pause while they talked up there in the indigo light, and after a while I saw the girl put a scotch and milk on top of the piano for Sonny. He didn't seem to notice it, but just before they started playing again, he sipped from it and looked toward me and nodded. Then he put it back on top of the piano. For me then, as they began to play again, it glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling. Well, you can see the power in the story. I mean, in that language which reaches very high notes and has a kind of improvisational musical quality about it and presents a vision of the African-American past. The story also reveals a strong sense of what I would describe as sociological distress that's experienced by many African Americans. There's even humor on this point when Sonny says laughingly about America that the Indians knew what they were doing when they got rid of it. It's a rather caustic thing to say, but you can see how somebody growing up in Harlem might feel that way. Though Baldwin has often been criticized for not being militant or political enough, this story has a strong sense of black alienation and the inability of blacks to meld into the melting pot. A key point of the famous Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal in a famous book of his on the United States called The American Dilemma, where he was able really to write about race and the inability of a melting pot to actually take place as America's dilemma. Baldwin is able to weave in a number of flashbacks with deftness, with fluidity, and he breaks with the conventional show, don't tell rule for narrative art and manages to work in an expository way while simultaneously telling a story. There are moments in the story where it almost seems like it's essay talking about Harlem, but it's all very much a part of, well, again, what Henry James called the figure in the carpet, and fits. Above all, Sonnys Blues is a powerful work of art. It's a masterpiece of short fiction that inaugurates great storytelling from succeeding generations of African American fiction writers. Ralph Ellison once said that if he wanted to preach, he would have become a sociologist rather than an artist. Well, Baldwin manages artistry and preaching, and his influence on fiction, especially African American fiction, by writers like Toni Morrison, John Edgar Weideman, and Ernest Gaines, has been singular. There's been this ongoing debate among African American writers whether they should be more political or whether they should be more artistic, or whether the weight should be on art or on politics. And it goes all the way back to the debate between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, or what Harold Crews in The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, a book that appeared years after the debate between Du Bois and Washington, said was at the heart of the divide among what Du Bois called the talented tenth, which he felt should lift up all other blacks, those who were educated and so forth, or the masses that Booker T. Washington believed needed to be separate in order to work their way up and find trades by which they could work their way up. We're going to continue to see more political didacticism in short fiction masterpieces. We see it to some degree in Baldwin, though obviously not like we see in Richard Wright, but we see it in three of the women writers who we're going to be looking at to come. A highly political writer from South Africa, politicized writer of Chinese descent, and a third woman writer from Canada who experiments with questions related to gender in fiction and fiction form in exciting new ways. We're also going to look at a work by a famous working class writer, Raymond Carver. Since stories by and about blue-collar folk or the proletariat or lower class begin to enter their long overdue place in the canon as being recognized as great literary art. But our next lecture also brings in a story of the working class, a contemporary initiation story by one of America's great short story writers and novelists. A&P by John Updike also represents and indeed epitomizes in so many ways the remarkable changes that were occurring as that decade of liberation and change, the 60s, began to take shape.